Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Hope you're doing well, guys. Welcome to my room. It's Sunday evening. Weekend is almost over. Passed too quickly. Some of us last weekend were lucky to have a 3-day weekend. In any case, this is how it is. So, might as well move on to my topic before this becomes miserable. I wanted to continue talking about the relationship between functions and more specifically the relationship between what in, let's say, in Myers-Briggs we call the extroverted functions and the introverted functions. So you know that there are in the main 4 main kinds of functions: 2 judgment functions and 2 perception functions, each of which comes in 2 forms: introverted and extroverted. Now, this particular framework and this division between those different functions comes from Jung. Jung does not provide the specific stack in his work that we find in Myers-Briggs, but I just wanted to mention, and I will come back to this in a future video, that I said something inaccurate in my previous video, in that there is a chapter in Jung, Psychology of Types, dedicated to auxiliary functions. I said in my previous video that he doesn't mention auxiliary functions. He actually does. Although Myers-Briggs goes a lot further, with results that can be criticized. Now that this has been corrected, and letting you know that I will come back to it, let us return to this question of the relationship between introverted and extroverted functions, because this is something that is more individualized and articulated in Myers-Briggs, in the sense that, for example, we have the notion of tertiary function, which, as far as I know, is not present in Jung. Now I'm a little bit less sure of myself, but I ought to try to be sure of myself, otherwise what's the point? I think that really what's really interesting here to try to look into is to understand why it is so intriguing, but at the same time potentially explainable, that extroverted and introverted functions have a relationship with one another of a certain kind. In the previous video, I talked about the relationship between the dominant function and the inferior function, which is in a sense symmetrical. It is in Jung as well as in MBTI. So I talked about NI and its relationship with inferior SE in INJ types. I tried to explain that NI cannot function without SE, in essence. In ESP types, the relationship is reversed. SE cannot function without NI. Because just in the same way that it's not possible to perceive in a purely introverted way, it's not possible to perceive in a purely extroverted way as well. There's always a relationship between the extroverted and the introverted. And this becomes less confusing when we keep in mind, and this is terminology that, as far as I can tell, is much more explicit in Jung, less explicit in Myers-Briggs, but really try to forget about the notion of introverts and extroverts for a second. The modern notions, the notion of what an introvert means, what an extrovert means. Obviously, this is a battlefield. Not everybody agrees on what these words mean. But imagine that in Jung, fundamentally what these words mean is objective and subjective. Extroverted means directed toward the object, objective. Introvert means directed toward the subject, subjective. There's no derogatory implications here. Like, this is not to say that the subjective function is less credible or less related, like less concerned with truth toward the world. Okay, the what is meant to be conveyed here is something purely functional. It is that every human being, in order to be a functional human being, needs to be constituted by both subjective and objective functions. Another way in which you could put it is to say that if you accept the metaphysics of the subject, which comes from Descartes, as some of you may know, if you accept this metaphysics, which by the way can be challenged in itself, but I will not challenge it here because this is not my purpose here. If you accept the metaphysics of the subject, you accept that human beings can be understood as subjects. If they can be understood as subjects, then they necessarily relate to objects. Now, if human beings are subjects that relate to objects, there needs to be a way for them to be possibly relating to objects. Since objects themselves are not subjects, most of them are what we would say, they don't have consciousness, like this glass of water or this desk. The way in which I relate to it is not only through my subjectivity, but through something that extends toward the object. So my subjectivity is constantly interacting with an objectivity. There could be lots of ways of going into the philosophical underpinnings of this view and trying to see whether it holds, whether it is consistent. But again, I can't go into too much detail here. Let's just assume that it is consistent and that experience and empirical facts confirms that it holds, that it is to some extent true, that it has some value. So every human subject has subjective functions and objective functions for the reasons I just gave. Now, to go further than this, if you remember that the subject, the mode of being of a subject from a psychological point of view can then be broadly divided into 4 functions. 2 functions of perception and 2 functions of judgment. Now, the really interesting aspect that Jung proposes to put forward in his work, and which is then improved upon or refined by Myers-Briggs, is that these 4 psychological cognitive functions reflect the metaphysical underpinnings of the constitution of the human subject, and the fact that from the subjectivity of the human subject there is necessarily an objective dimension which allows the reaching toward the object. Because if that were not the case, then we would all be living in our own heads, basically. We would all be solipsists. So what he says is essentially, if you're a human subject, like you, like me, or whoever else, one of the fundamental things we do in order to operate in the world is that we perceive things. The ability to perceive things around us is one of the very, very primary things that is built into our constitution. But it's not possible to perceive something purely subjectively or to perceive something purely objectively, for reasons I already gave. If we perceive purely subjectively, we would be solipsists. If we perceived purely objectively, we would not really have a subjective consciousness. We would not have opinions, for example. We would, in a way, you could describe a being that perceives purely objectively as a computer, for example, or a machine, an intelligent machine of some kind. The lack of subjectivity is not so different from the problem with artificial intelligence. It's hard to imagine how subjectivity could be injected into the build-up of an artificial intelligence so that they could be human-like. So you need both. Now, you need both in terms of perception and you need both in terms of judgments, because once you perceive something, it's not enough to just perceive it. You need to be able to recognize it as something that you're familiar with, or see it for the first time and bring it into the arsenal of the things that you know about the world so that you can bring it into categories. So if you see a new kind of, let's say you see a new kind of building that you've never seen before, well, you're going to be able to recognize its shape and a commonality of shape that will allow you to see that it is a building. So you can say, I'm not familiar with this kind of building, but I know it's a building. When you've said that, you've already made a judgment. You've not just perceived. The perception is what you reach out to, the data that is outside you that you reach out to, and it's interacting with your subjective perception as well. But there is also a judgment that's made. Oh, that's a building. Now, that's a judgment. That's not just a perception, okay? You will not be able to recognize the building as a building if you were not able to judge on top of the pure naked perception. And so this gives you a good idea of why psychologically judgment and perception are intricately linked together, and why it makes sense that if perception should have a subjective and objective pole, it should be the case of judgment as well. So that if NI has to function with SE, then by symmetry SI would have to function with NE with SI, SE with NI. But then similarly, judgment would have to do the same. So if and then let's say comes the notion of the auxiliary. If you're an NI dominant, and so you reach out to the world with SE unconsciously and integrate this data consciously but subjectively with NI, the judgments that you're going to make based on it, so when you see a building, when you see many more complicated things that are of a social nature, for example, if your judgment is extroverted, if your auxiliary judgment function is extroverted, so let's say it's FE or TE, then the tertiary judgment function will have to be introverted, because again there's the same complementarity, and vice versa. If your auxiliary judgment function is introverted, then your tertiary judgment function will have to be extroverted. So in the case of an INFP, the FI is introverted, but the TE tertiary is extroverted. And the symmetry between the dominant and the inferior contains within itself a smaller but equally defensible symmetry between the auxiliary and the tertiary. Now, I don't know if this is Jung or if this is Myers-Briggs or if this is Rowan-Contini. To be honest, maybe I'm theorizing with you guys, and if this is a bit difficult to understand or if you disagree, also let me know in the comments. This is also a discussion. But the basic idea is that if you follow this concept of the complementarity of the subjective and the objective and the functions, you inevitably have to add to the complementarity between sensing perceiving and intuitive perceiving, the complementarity of feeling judging and thinking judging. And it's possible to go into more detail as to, for example, why if you're an extroverted judger of the feeling type, then you will be an introverted judger of the thinking type. And if you're an introverted judger of the thinking type, then you will be an extrovert judger of the feeling type. Now there's a principle for this that I will propose to flesh out in a later video, which is the idea that basically it's not, just in the same way that it's not possible to perceive purely subjectively or objectively, it's not possible to judge purely subjectively or purely objectively. You always need a balance. And since it's not possible to judge purely objectively, since it's not possible to judge with the same function in an introverted manner, or rather, since it's not possible to judge purely subjectively, and since it's not possible to, when you're judging subjectively, to judge with the two different judgment functions, then you have to judge also with an extroverted functions, for instance. So for example, if you judge with TI, you have to judge with an extroverted function as well, okay? But you cannot judge with TE. You cannot judge with TE because T and TI are like in exclusive conflict in this case. So inevitably you judge with FE. And this logic, which I have somewhat roughly explained here, I'll explain it in more detail in a later video, can be applied to get basically the 16 function stack. So that's a possible account of the logic behind, really the logic, at a purely logical level, logic behind how from Jung we can arrive at the 16 types. See you guys, enjoy the rest of your Sunday.